May 1918. Europe was drowning in fire, mud, and blood. On the Western Front, soldiers lived inside trenches carved into the earth like open wounds. They slept beside rats, breathed smoke and decay, and waited for the next artillery barrage. On the Eastern Front, armies kept moving, collapsing, regrouping, and attacking again. Across the world, newspapers counted the dead, governments sold war bonds, and families prayed their sons would survive long enough to return home. Humanity thought it already knew the face of catastrophe. It wore a uniform, it carried a rifle, it arrived with cannon fire. But while the world was staring at the battlefield, another enemy was beginning to move. It had no flag, no army, no border, and no command. It did not need bullets, it needed only breath, a cough in a barracks, a handshake between soldiers, a shared cup in a crowded mess hall, a troop ship crossing the Atlantic with hundreds of men below deck. This enemy was invisible, patient, and perfectly suited to the world that war had created. It was an influenza A virus, H1N1, later remembered by one of the most misleading names in medical history, the Spanish flu. The disease did not necessarily begin in Spain. Historians still debate its exact origin. Some early outbreaks were recorded in military camps in the United States, while other theories point to Europe or Asia. Spain became attached to the name for a different reason. It was neutral during the First World War. Unlike countries at war, Spain did not censor its newspapers as strictly. Spanish papers openly reported the outbreak, including illness among public figures, so the world began to associate the disease with Spain. So it became Spanish flu. But the virus belonged to no nation. It moved wherever people moved, and in 1918, war had turned human movement into a global machine. Millions of soldiers were mobilized. Recruits were packed into camps. Ships crossed oceans. Military hospitals overflowed. Civilians gathered for parades, funerals, church services, and patriotic rallies. Every crowd became an opportunity. At first, the disease seemed almost ordinary. Many people developed fever, headache, fatigue, body aches, and cough. Most recovered after several days. Because of that, leaders and citizens made a fatal mistake. They treated the outbreak as an inconvenience, not a warning. But viruses do not need human fear to become dangerous. They need opportunity, and the First World War gave this virus opportunity on a historic scale. Exhausted soldiers became ideal hosts. Overcrowded camps gave it speed. Troop ships gave it distance. Trenches gave it density. Wartime censorship gave it silence. The world was not merely infected by a virus, it had been prepared for one. Behind headlines about battles and peace negotiations, the pandemic began building its own front line. No map showed its advance. No general commanded it. Yet it crossed borders faster than armies. It entered homes, hospitals, factories, schools, churches, islands, and palaces. By the time humanity understood the danger, the disease had become one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. Modern estimates place the death toll at around 50 million people worldwide, with some estimates higher. But what made it especially terrifying was not only how many died, it was who died. Influenza usually kills the very young, the very old, and people already weakened by illness. In 1918, many victims were young adults in the prime of life. Soldiers, nurses, workers, fathers, and mothers. Strong bodies became battlegrounds. Faces turned blue, lungs filled. Doctors watched helplessly as patients suffocated while still conscious. This is the story of a pandemic that arrived in the shadow of war and killed with a silence more frightening than gunfire. It is also a story of denial, censorship, medical confusion, public resistance, sacrifice, and courage. Because in 1918, humanity discovered a brutal truth. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one standing in front of us. It is the one we breathe in before we even know it is there. The first signs did not look like the beginning of a global disaster. They looked ordinary. A soldier with fever, another with a headache, a third coughing too hard to train. In spring 1918, outbreaks of influenza-like illness appeared in military camps in the United States. One frequently mentioned location was Camp Funston, part of Fort Riley in Kansas. Large numbers of soldiers suddenly reported flu-like symptoms. At the time, it seemed serious, but not terrifying. Many men recovered. Commanders saw it as a disruption, not a catastrophe. The war in Europe still mattered more. The United States had entered the First World War in 1917, and by 1918 it was rushing troops across the Atlantic. Every trained soldier was needed. Every ship had to be filled. Every delay was treated as a threat to victory. So the illness was downplayed. Officials reassured the public. Military leaders focused on morale. Newspapers avoided panic. During wartime, information was controlled almost as carefully as ammunition. A frightening outbreak could damage the war effort. But the virus did not care about morale. It moved through barracks, mess halls, training grounds, medical tents, rail stations, and transport ships. A camp full of young recruits was almost perfect for infection, crowded, stressful, and constantly connected to other bases. Then the soldiers moved, and the virus moved with them. As troop ships crossed the Atlantic, infected men carried the disease toward Europe. Some were already sick. Others had mild symptoms. Some may have carried the virus without realizing it. Below deck, men slept in tight rows, breathing the same stale air for days. Ventilation was poor. Space was limited. Fatigue weakened their bodies. A single cough could turn a compartment into a danger zone. The ships meant to carry reinforcements became moving chambers of infection. When these troops reached Europe, the disease entered ports, rail lines, supply camps, military hospitals, and eventually the front itself. There, in the trenches, the virus found an even more brutal world. The Western Front was overcrowded, filthy, and exhausted. Soldiers lived in mud, cold, and fear. They often lacked sleep, clean water, fresh food, and proper medical care. Their bodies were weakened by stress, wounds, poison gas, and constant danger. Inside the trenches, distance was impossible. Men shared dugouts, blankets, cigarettes, tools, letters, water, and air. They huddled during bombardments, carried wounded comrades, and slept shoulder to shoulder. No one could isolate properly in the middle of a war. So the virus moved from soldier to soldier, from unit to unit, then from military zones into civilian life. At this stage, the first wave was still relatively mild compared with what would follow. Many people developed fever, body aches, cough, and weakness, then recovered. That made the danger easy to underestimate. Governments continued moving troops, civilians continued gathering, cities continued working, and the virus kept riding that machinery. Soldiers on leave carried it home, sailors carried it to ports, wounded men carried it into hospitals, workers carried it into crowded neighborhoods. Colonial troops, refugees, merchants, nurses, and railway staff became part of the same invisible network. The first wave had shown that the virus could travel, but because it had not yet shown its most terrifying face, the world failed to understand the warning. People saw recovery and mistook it for safety. Officials saw manageable illness and mistook it for control. Armies saw disruption and kept moving men across oceans. Somewhere in that vast chain of bodies, the virus began to change. The first wave had opened the door. The second wave would walk through it with far deadlier force. Then the virus returned. And this time, it was no longer ordinary. By late summer and early autumn of 1918, a second wave of influenza spread through military camps, ports, and cities. The first wave had moved quickly, but many patients recovered. The second wave killed with shocking speed. One of the most horrifying scenes unfolded at Camp Devens in Massachusetts. At first, the illness resembled common influenza. A soldier might complain of fever, headache, sore throat, and exhaustion. He might enter the infirmary expecting rest and a few days away from duty. But within hours, everything could change. The fever rose violently. The cough became deep and painful. The lungs began to fail. Some patients coughed so hard that blood came from the nose and mouth. Their breathing became desperate, as if every breath had to be dragged through water. As oxygen vanished from the bloodstream, their skin changed color. A healthy young man could turn pale, then gray, then blue, then almost black. Doctors and nurses watched strong soldiers become unrecognizable. At Camp Devens, the medical system was overwhelmed. Beds filled faster than they could be prepared. Nurses moved from one gasping patient to another. Some victims died so quickly that staff barely had time to record their names. In crowded wards, the dead sometimes remained near the living because there were not enough people to remove the bodies immediately. War had taught people to expect death on battlefields, but now death came in hospital beds, houses, offices, schools, and streetcars. It came without bullets, explosions, or warning. It entered through the lungs and turned the body into a battlefield. While doctors struggled to understand the disaster, one American city made a decision that would become a warning for generations. Philadelphia. In September 1918, the city planned a massive parade to promote Liberty Bonds, which helped finance the war. Public health experts warned that influenza was already spreading. They feared that bringing thousands of people together would create perfect conditions for transmission. But the parade went ahead. On September 28, 1918, about 200,000 people crowded into Philadelphia's streets. They came to cheer soldiers, wave flags, and show support for the war. From the outside, it looked like unity and courage, but to the virus, it was opportunity. People stood shoulder to shoulder. They shouted, laughed, coughed, and breathed the same air. Children sat on shoulders. Soldiers marched through crowds that believed they were celebrating strength. Within days, hospitals were overwhelmed. Within a week, thousands were sick or dead. Soon, the city could not keep up with the bodies. Funeral homes ran out of space. Coffins became scarce. Families waited for help that did not come. In some neighborhoods, bodies remained inside homes because undertakers and grave diggers were too few, too sick, or too exhausted. Philadelphia had marched for victory. Then it began digging mass graves. The lesson was brutal. During a pandemic, denial does not prevent panic. It delays action until the price becomes unbearable. After tragedies like Philadelphia, many cities introduced stricter public health measures. Schools closed, churches suspended services, theaters and cinemas went dark, public gatherings were banned, emergency hospitals were created in public buildings. These measures were simple, but they were among the only tools available. There were no antiviral drugs for influenza. There was no flu vaccine. There were no modern ventilators, intensive care units, or rapid tests. Public health depended on reducing contact. Fewer crowds, fewer gatherings, fewer chances for the virus to move between bodies. But action came unevenly. Some cities moved quickly, others hesitated. Some officials feared economic damage. Others feared lowering morale during wartime. Some newspapers softened the truth. Some leaders acted as if confidence alone could defeat infection. The virus used every delay. The second wave proved that the pandemic was not only biological, it was also a test of leadership, communication, and public trust. Where warnings were ignored, death accelerated. Where crowds continued, outbreaks exploded. Where leaders minimized danger, citizens often followed. The world was beginning to understand that this was not ordinary flu. It was a global catastrophe moving through a world already weakened by war. And after the bodies piled up, another conflict was about to begin. Not between armies, but between public health and personal freedom. As the second wave tore through cities, governments finally acted with urgency. Public life began to close down. Schools shut their doors. Churches suspended services. Theaters, cinemas, dance halls, and meeting halls were closed in many cities. Large gatherings were banned. People were told to avoid crowds, reduce travel, and isolate the sick whenever possible. These measures were not perfect, but in 1918, they were among the only defenses humanity had. There were no modern antiviral drugs, no influenza vaccine, no rapid tests. Doctors could treat symptoms, offer limited oxygen, and try to keep patients alive, but they had no direct weapon against the virus. So public health returned to a simple principle. If the virus moves through human contact, then human contact must be reduced. And then came the mask. In places such as San Francisco, mask wearing became mandatory. These masks were usually made from gauze or simple cloth. Compared with modern medical masks, they were basic and often poorly fitted. Some people wore them incorrectly. Others reused them too long. Even so, the mask became more than fabric. It became a symbol. For supporters, it meant responsibility. It meant accepting that one person's breath could endanger another. Wearing a mask was a way of saying, I may not be sick, but I can still protect you. During a pandemic, survival does not depend only on hospitals. It depends on millions of small decisions made by ordinary people. But not everyone agreed. In San Francisco, opposition grew into the Anti-Mask League. Its members argued that mandatory masks violated personal freedom. They claimed masks were uncomfortable, useless, humiliating, and unscientific. Some refused to wear them in public. Others accepted fines rather than obey. To public health officials, masks were protection. To opponents, they were control. This conflict revealed a painful truth. Even when facing the same danger, people do not always agree on what survival should require. Resistance appeared beyond America as well. In parts of Europe, newspapers and citizens criticized strict health measures. Some called closures unnecessary. Business owners feared losing income. Workers feared losing wages. Families were exhausted after years of war, rationing, grief, and uncertainty. By late 1918, people were tired of fear. So when the second wave began to decline, many were desperate to believe the nightmare had ended. Deaths slowed. Hospitals became less crowded. Emergency restrictions were lifted. Masks came off. People returned to churches, shops, theaters, markets, and public celebrations. Leaders wanted recovery. Cities needed business. Families needed hope. But hope can become dangerous when it arrives too early. Medical experts warned that influenza could return, especially as colder weather pushed people indoors. The virus had not vanished. It had only lost momentum for a time. Yet many ignored the warning. Opponents of restrictions felt vindicated. To them, the falling death toll seemed to prove that masks and closures had been unnecessary. But a temporary decline was not victory. In early 1919, the third wave arrived. It was generally less catastrophic than the second, but it still killed many people. For families who had survived the worst months of 1918, this new wave felt especially cruel. The war had ended. Crowds had celebrated the armistice. People had begun to imagine peace and recovery. Then fever returned. This time, even the powerful were not beyond reach. In April 1919, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson became seriously ill while attending the Paris Peace Conference. At the moment world leaders were negotiating the post-war future, the virus entered the rooms of power. Whether or not his illness changed history, one fact was clear. The pandemic respected no rank. It struck workers and presidents, soldiers and civilians, nurses and prisoners, children and elders. Authority could not command it to stop. By the time the third wave faded, the world had learned that a pandemic is fought not only in hospitals, but also in streets, newspapers, churches, courts, and private homes. A virus spreads through bodies, but denial spreads through belief. One of the most disturbing mysteries of the Spanish flu was this. Why did it kill so many young and healthy people? Seasonal influenza usually takes its heaviest toll on infants, the elderly, and people whose bodies are already weakened. But in 1918, the pattern was different. Many victims were adults in the prime of life. Soldiers, nurses, factory workers, parents, and students. People who looked strong in the morning could be fighting for breath by night. To families, it felt impossible to understand. A young man could walk into a hospital with fever and cough, still able to speak and still expecting to recover. Hours later, his skin might turn blue. His breathing might become shallow and desperate. Blood might appear at his lips. By the next day, he could be dead. The disease seemed to punish strength itself. Today, scientists believe several factors made the 1918 flu so deadly. One important explanation involves the immune system. In a normal infection, the immune system protects the body by identifying danger and attacking it. It sends chemical signals called cytokines to call immune cells into action. Usually, this response is controlled. But sometimes, the immune system overreacts. Instead of attacking only the invading virus, the body releases too many inflammatory signals. The lungs become swollen and damaged. Blood vessels leak. Fluid fills the spaces where oxygen should enter the bloodstream. The The defense system becomes so violent that it helps destroy the patient it is trying to save. This is often described as a cytokine storm. That may help explain why young adults suffered so badly. A strong immune system can produce a powerful response, but if that response loses control, strength becomes dangerous. The body turns into its own battlefield. Another major cause of death was bacterial pneumonia. The flu virus damaged the respiratory tract, making it easier for bacteria to invade the lungs. Today, antibiotics can treat many bacterial infections. In 1918, antibiotics did not yet exist. That meant doctors had almost no reliable way to stop pneumonia once it took hold. Patients were attacked twice, first by the virus, then by bacterial infection. Their lungs filled with fluid, pus, and blood. Breathing became a battle. The blue or black color reported by witnesses was a sign that the body was being starved of oxygen. Doctors saw this horror every day, but they did not fully understand the enemy. Medical science in 1918 was far behind what we know today. Scientists had made progress in bacteriology, and many believed bacteria caused most infectious diseases. Viruses were still poorly understood. They were too small to be seen with ordinary microscopes. The electron microscope had not yet been invented. Researchers searched for bacteria in blood, sputum, and lung tissue, but again and again, they failed to identify the true cause. The killer was there. Humanity simply could not see it. This blindness shaped everything. Without knowing exactly what they were fighting, doctors tried whatever methods seemed possible. Some treatments offered comfort. Others may have made patients worse. Aspirin was widely used to reduce fever and pain. At the time, some doctors prescribed extremely high doses by modern standards. Today, we know that excessive aspirin can be dangerous. It can cause poisoning, abnormal breathing, vomiting, confusion, bleeding problems, and organ damage. In a patient already struggling with severe influenza, such effects could push the body closer to collapse. Aspirin was not the main cause of the pandemic, but it shows how medical uncertainty can become dangerous during a crisis. When doctors lack clear knowledge, even well-intentioned treatment can harm. Other methods were even more desperate. Some physicians used bloodletting, an ancient practice based on the belief that removing bad blood could help the body recover. But flu patients needed strength, oxygen, fluids, and rest. Removing blood only made many weaker. Some tried steam rooms or hot baths, believing heat would kill the virus. But heat did not destroy the infection inside the lungs. Instead, patients could become dehydrated, overheated, and exhausted. Others turned to purgatives, alcohol, herbal mixtures, or harsh chemicals. In panic, families reached for anything that promised hope. Many remedies did nothing against the virus. Some damaged the body further. These treatments were signs of fear. When people face an invisible enemy and science has no clear answer, desperation fills the gap. Rumors spread. Miracle cures appear. False confidence becomes attractive. The doctors and nurses of 1918 were not careless. Many were brave and worked until they collapsed. Their tragedy was that courage was not enough. They were fighting a 20th century pandemic with 19th century tools. No antivirals, no antibiotics, no modern ventilators, no advanced intensive care, no clear understanding of the virus itself. The Spanish flu revealed the limits of medicine with brutal honesty. It showed that knowledge can be as important as bravery. It showed that a disease becomes more deadly when societies delay, when leaders hide the truth, and when doctors are forced to act without evidence. The young and strong became reminders of a terrible truth. Sometimes the body's greatest power can become its greatest danger. But even in the darkest months of the pandemic, humanity did not disappear. In hospitals, nurses worked until their bodies nearly gave out. They cleaned blood from patients' mouths, changed sheets, carried water, and held the hands of strangers dying far from families. Some collapsed onto the floor, slept for minutes, then returned to wards. Doctors fought with limited knowledge. Volunteers delivered food to infected homes. Neighbors cared for orphaned children. Priests, drivers, gravediggers, and ordinary citizens stepped into roles they never expected. When medicine failed, compassion became one of the last lights left. Communities fought back in practical ways. Schools, churches, theaters, and public halls closed. Temporary hospitals were built in community centers. Volunteers from groups such as the Red Cross cooked meals, transported patients, and helped bury the dead when families were too sick or too few. These actions saved lives, but they were not what finally ended the pandemic. The ending came slowly and unevenly. Cases fell, deaths declined, hospitals emptied, the virus lost momentum. After infecting so many people, it had fewer vulnerable hosts left. Survivors gained some immunity. At the same time, the virus may have changed, becoming less deadly as it continued circulating. A virus that kills too quickly can destroy its own path of transmission. The Spanish flu did not vanish completely. It became part of seasonal influenza history. But the cost was almost impossible to comprehend. Around 50 million deaths worldwide, broken families, orphaned children, shaken governments, and public trust damaged by censorship and fear. Yet from this disaster came change. Scientists took viruses more seriously. Public health became not only a hospital problem, but a social responsibility. Early warnings, honest communication, isolation, masks, and cooperation could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. A hospital can treat a patient, but a society must decide whether to protect one another before the hospital bed is needed. That is the legacy of 1918. The Spanish flu warns us that denial can be deadly, misinformation can travel faster than disease, and freedom without responsibility can become dangerous during a crisis. It also reminds us that science is not weakness, caution is not cowardice, and compassion is humanity's strongest defense. More than a century has passed, but the lesson remains alive. Nature does not need our permission to humble us. A virus cannot be threatened by armies, negotiated with by presidents, or stopped by pride. It moves through small human habits. A breath, a touch, a crowded room, a warning ignored too long. Humanity survives not because it is invincible, but because it learns. If this story helped you understand one of history's deadliest pandemics, don't forget to subscribe. In the next videos, we will uncover forgotten disasters, hidden warnings, and events that shaped our world.